When it comes to the Pearl Harbor battleships, you have two kinds of notoriety. The ships known for their sinking in Arizona and Oklahoma, and the ships known for their rising from the ashes of the attack to become, for all intents and purposes, better than they were when they were hit. The prime example of the latter is USS West Virginia. Here you have a ship that took some of the absolute worst damage of the attack. A ship that, in most circumstances, was so heavily damaged she would likely have been scrapped. And yet, in a mix of a need for every battleship available and sheer stubborn pride, the United States Navy raised her. They raised her and put her in for such an extensive rebuild, she practically came out a new ship. It's a shame she came back into service so late in the war as a result, but West Virginia would still get the chance to shine at a place named Surigao Strait. However, this adventurous life almost ended before it began. USS West Virginia was laid down on April 12, 1920, as the fourth and final member of the Colorado-class battleships. In this, she was the last of the standard type, which were, in an ideal world, going to soon be surpassed by the first South Dakota class. However, the Washington Treaty would be signed while West Virginia was under construction, and that rather changed things. While the ship remained the last of the standards, she was also suddenly the last American battleship, period, for at least some time. This would have been enough of a change in fate as it was. However, the treaty also stipulated that one of the four Colorado class would have to be scrapped or otherwise disposed of. Colorado and Maryland, the first two, were well underway and too advanced in construction to be thrown aside like that. That left the second pair, USS Washington, BB-47, and USS West Virginia. At first glance, one would have expected Washington to be completed and West Virginia to be scrapped. Washington was, after all, laid down first on June 30th, 1919, and launched first on September 1st, 1921. In comparison, West Virginia only entered the water on November 17th, 1921. As such, it may seem logical that Washington would be the ship to survive the treaty. Obviously, it would not turn out that way. The exact reason why is somewhat vague, and I'm not aware of any definitive answer on this topic. Certainly, Friedman doesn't make any note of it, which he normally would, though there are some conclusions one can draw from his writing. There are further implications that can be drawn from the construction of the two ships as well. Near as I can tell, what seems likely is that it was largely driven by construction times. I will reiterate, again, that I am unaware of a concrete answer to this question. If such an answer exists, by all means let me know, and I'll do a pinned comment for it. I'll go into more detail on my thoughts here in a future video on Washington. Suffice it to say, for now, my theory is that it was likely a matter of West Virginia just being faster to build. In any case, having survived the Washington Treaty, the battleship went through her fitting out process, commissioning into the fleet on December 1st, 1923. This fit her weaponry and other equipment to the ship, the process of which made her fit for service. And since the equipment she carried marked her as one of the most powerful battleships of her era, let's cover that real quick. In her initial design, West Virginia displaced about 33,000 tons. That displacement allowed for carrying 8 16-inch rifles in 4 twin turrets. These were mounted in a fairly typical layout of super-firing pairs, one fore and one aft. Nothing special here, other than in being one of 3 American battleships to actually carry 16-inch guns during that period. Her secondary battery consists of the same 5-inch 51 caliber gun equipped to American battleships since the Florida class. The exact number of these weapons is something of a question mark, though, with the count varying from 16 to 12, depending on what source you look at. I would go for 12, personally, as Friedman notes that as her loadout in 1926, just a couple years after commissioning. At best, she would have only carried the higher number of guns for a very short time. Her anti-aircraft battery, at the same 1926 date, would have been 8 3-inch guns. Not exactly mind-blowing, but for the mid-20s, not surprising either. The same could be said for the 2 submerged 21-inch torpedo tubes. Her speed, then, was in keeping with the other standard-type battleships, at 21 knots on 28,900 shaft horsepower. This was sent through 4 shafts by a turboelectric drive system, something the United States Navy was quite fond of at the time. To round things out then, her armor protection was, again, functionally the same as the other standards. The same all-or-nothing armor scheme, and the same 13.5-inch main belt. With that done, we can get to the topic of her service history. West Virginia's initial service began on something of a sour note, as she contrived to run aground soon after finishing her shakedown cruise. Though, to be fair, she had a more valid reason for this than most battleships. On June 16, 1924, she was steaming down the Lynnhaven Channel, all fine and normal until the helmsman noticed that the rudder indicator wasn't working. Understandably, the captain ordered the emergency bell to the steering room rung, which did nothing. A further attempt to stop the engines failed as well, because the engine room telegraph also wasn't working. So with all the fancy means of communication broken, the captain shouted into the voice tube on the bridge like this was the age of sail. He ordered full speed ahead on the port engine and to stop the starboard one in an attempt to steer the battleship with her engines. Unfortunately, all this effort only succeeded in making her grounding a soft one, though, I grant you, it could have easily been worse, and her crew should be commended for their effort to work around faulty equipment. It should also be noted that she had issues with her steering gear prior to this, so it was a bit of a recurring issue at that point. Once the repairs from that were complete, West Virginia was assigned to flagship duty for the battle fleet on October 30th, 1924. Her time in the 1920s would follow the general trajectory for most navies in the period, being long stretches of training and exercises. In spite of her rough start, though, she quickly marked herself as one of the better battleships in the fleet, namely by winning multiple gunnery awards as early as 1925. As a battleship is primarily a tool for carrying around her big guns, this is a good thing for West Virginia. Past this, things were fairly typical, as I noted. She participated in the various fleet problems and helped form American fleet doctrine for the future. This is, however, not unique to her, as the other battleships did much the same. During all of this, things were coming up good for West Virginia after her rough start. Unfortunately, her bad luck came back during Fleet Problem 11. This took place in 1930 and saw West Virginia, alongside her later berthing mate Tennessee, succeed in engaging an aircraft carrier in a gun duel. They even knocked her out of action in their simulated engagement. Except there's a slight issue here, being that they attacked their own carrier. The fleet problems often paired Lexington and Saratoga on opposite sides of the enemy fleets. These were intended to test doctrine and various ideas to improve the fleet, and putting the big flat tops against each other is included in this. In Fleet Problem 11, then, West Virginia was sailing with Saratoga, which she and Tennessee mistook for her nearly identical sister, which ended up with them costing their fleet its carrier. As one could expect, better communication between ships and better target identification training became a mandatory thing after that incident. Around the same time, in the early 1930s, West Virginia was slightly refit. Her aging 3-inch anti-aircraft battery was replaced by larger 5-inch 25 caliber guns. A few 50 caliber machine guns were fitted as well. In addition to this, West Virginia gained catapults on her aft deck and her number 3 turret for scout planes. This would help with long-range gunnery in the days before radar. More extensive refits were planned, off and on, during the 1930s, while West Virginia continued her usual interwar duties. These ranged from fitting torpedo bulges at the low end to reboilering the ships and fitting bulges at the more expensive end. There were also suggestions to fit new masts to replace the old lattice masts, though these went nowhere. In fact, all of the plans went nowhere. With how expensive a proper rebuild could be, Friedman notes it as anything from $8 million on the low end to $38 million on the high end. This is little surprise. The Navy had to watch spending, and with any rebuild coming out of funds for construction of new and more capable battleships, you can probably see the issue here. In the end, the best the Big Five battleships, the Colorados and Tennessees, could get, was a limited torpedo blister, and only two of the ships, Maryland and Colorado, would even get that. West Virginia was intended for it, but she swapped orders with Colorado. Though, West Virginia did get to be one of the first ships fitted with the CXAM-1 radar, so there's that. In any case, with Colorado swapping refit times, West Virginia would be present in Pearl Harbor on a fateful December morning. In fact, West Virginia had been in Hawaiian waters for some time by this point. She had moved with the rest of the Pacific Fleet when Pearl Harbor was assigned as a new fleet base in 1940, and had been training intensely in Hawaiian waters. That training, alas, did not prepare her for the actual attack to come. Moored outboard of Tennessee on December 7, 1941, West Virginia was one of the most heavily targeted battleships during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. She would take hits from 2 bombs, both modified 16-inch shells, and 7 torpedoes. The first bomb hit her port casemates, wrecking those and her galley, while starting the first of many, many fires. The second bomb, meanwhile, was a dud, though the armor-piercing cap at least did its job. It punched through West Virginia's turret-mounted scout plane before continuing through to penetrate the roof of Turret 3. Despite not detonating, the bomb wrecked one of the guns in that turret, and the gasoline from the wrecked scout plane would also contribute to the fires that would, eventually, envelop the battleship. As it was, though, the torpedoes were the larger threat and did the majority of damage to West Virginia. 1 hit her rudder, 3 hit below her armor belt, 1 hit on her armor belt, and the remaining 2 went into holes opened up by the earlier impacts. This allowed them to detonate inside the ship against her armored deck, which had less than pretty results on the interior of the battleship. Prompt action by her assistant fire control officer, Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, saved the ship from Oklahoma's fate. He ordered counterflooding almost immediately after the initial torpedo hits, which allowed West Virginia to ultimately settle on the bottom upright instead of capsizing. His actions were just one heroic act of many that day. Further examples include her captain staying aboard and giving orders, even after a bomb fragment from Tennessee mortally wounded him. He continued to give orders to save his ship until the very last moment, with the result that he would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. So dedicated to his duty was he, that the man protested being moved from the bridge, even after he was wounded. A man that helped move him is another case of heroism here. That man was Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant. Not only did he help move the captain and many other men later on, he also manned one of the old 50 caliber machine guns mounted to the aft of the conning tower. In spite of no training on the weapon, Miller fired until he ran out of ammo, potentially downing 2 Japanese aircraft in the process. Many, many other men performed heroic actions in their efforts to keep the ship afloat. They counter-flooded her and closed bulkheads. They fought fires caused by the destroyed aircraft, in addition to leaking oil from both West Virginia and Arizona. These men, aboard both West Virginia and Tennessee, fought the fires until they couldn't fight any longer, and the blaze became too strong. Eventually forced to abandon ship, West Virginia would be left ablaze until the next day, settling to the mud and muck of the harbor bottom. The efforts of her crew were not in vain, though. Thanks to the prompt counterflooding, West Virginia was in a fit state to salvage, in spite of the extensive damage she had sustained. The battleship would be refloated on May 17, 1942, after patches were placed over the damaged areas in her hull. Once pumped out and reinforced to be safe to move, the crippled battleship was towed into dry dock on June 9th. During this process, both in moving her and in dock, it was discovered that she took the 7 torpedo hits. Initially, reports had only noted 5. The fact she took 7 came as something of a surprise in this regard. Another surprise, and one that is rather more morbid, would be the discovery of many of her crew still entombed inside her hull. I've seen the numbers 66 and 70 for this, though regardless of which number you use, it was still unpleasant work to pull out all those remains and try to identify the men. A process made ever more unpleasant by the fact that 3 men were found in an airtight storeroom where they had apparently taken shelter during the attack. These men survived in that storeroom for at least 16 days, according to a calendar found with them. Eventually, either the air or food and fresh water ran out, and the men died there. With this morbid task done, however, the work to patch the ship up continued. West Virginia was eventually fit for sailing home in April 1943, at which point the ship set out for Bremerton for proper repairs. These repairs would ultimately take the shape of a complete rebuild. Her old superstructure was torn out, replaced with a completely new design. Her conning tower was pulled out and replaced with one from a Brooklyn-class cruiser to reduce weight and improve firing arcs of her anti-aircraft weaponry. The foremast was replaced with a new tower mast that improved her bridge layout and gave her a new main battery director. Furthermore, her two funnels were replaced with one, much larger funnel, mounted just behind her tower. The result was a bridge structure that looked remarkably similar to that of the new South Dakota class. This was matched with similarly extensive modifications to her secondary battery. Her casemates were torn out and replaced by 8 twin mounts for 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. These were fit forward to a side, in common with the rebuilds for other standard-type battleships. Also in common with general American practice was the fitting of more advanced radar for her guns and new fire directors, as well as 10 quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts and between 40 to 50 20mm cannon. Perhaps the largest, though not as visible, change was to her beam. Fitted with improved anti-torpedo protection, which was clearly necessary now, West Virginia's beam increased to 114 feet. This served to lock her to the Pacific, for all intents and purposes, as she was now too wide for the Panama Canal. It is likely this decision that delayed her return to service, as she had to wait until after Tennessee and California to receive her refit, due to a plain lack of dock space on the West Coast. The result would be that, in her radically rebuilt configuration, West Virginia only returned to service in July of 1944. And even then, she still had to undergo sea trials all over again, which kept her from truly rejoining the fleet until September. By this point, the naval war was really largely over, since Japan had been pushed back almost to where the war began, gradually losing its Pacific Island holdings to either invasions or blockade. Only one grand fleet battle remained, as West Virginia sailed to the Philippines in October to join that invasion. Even in this, the old battleship's luck would prove to be of a decidedly mixed variety. Because, on October 18th, West Virginia had to dodge a mine that California cut loose ahead of her. It would have been the height of misfortune to go through that massive rebuild, only to strike a mine cut loose by another Pearl Harbor veteran the moment she returned to combat. That being said, she avoided the mine and set about shore bombardment duty in concert with the other old battleships. It was about all she could do at that point, being too slow to keep up with the carriers, and Japan not sending their ships to contest the landings. Yet, anyway. Before that could come, though, West Virginia faced her old nemesis, running aground on the 21st of October, which damaged 3 of her 4 screws. Not seriously enough to pull her from the theater, but badly enough that vibrations limited her to 16 knots. 18 if the situation was bad enough to push her to it. Fortunately for her, she didn't need to be fast to set off the shore of the various Philippine islands and blast away at Japanese positions. That she would continue to do, with her main guns hammering the shore and her anti-aircraft battery deterring any attacks from the air. That slow speed would, in addition, relegate West Virginia, and the other old standards, to guarding the southern flank of the landings when the Japanese decided to contest them. In this, West Virginia would lead a line consisting of fellow Pearl Harbor veterans, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, as well as the USS Mississippi. On the night of October 24th, 1944, these old battleships would, guided by radar, engage the Japanese southern force. Ignoring the skirmishing by PT boats and destroyers, the Americans heavily outgunned the Japanese formation, led by the old Yamashiro and Fuso. With Fuso knocked out of action early, the American battleships pounded Yamashiro and the cruiser Mogami instead. West Virginia fired first, likely hitting Yamashiro's bridge with her first salvo. In the end, West Virginia fired 16 salvos from her 16-inch main battery, crippling Yamashiro and prompting the remnants of the southern force to retreat in the face of the American formation. The rest of her wartime service after this point was a return to shore bombardment duties, along with fending off kamikazes. After repairs to her screws, this duty took her first to the Philippines again, and then to Iwo Jima. During all of this, West Virginia escaped damage for a long time. The same couldn't be said for her targets, as she downed multiple kamikazes, and when she arrived off Iwo Jima, she succeeded in hitting an ammunition or fuel dump, prompting 2 hours of secondary detonations. She would remain off Iwo Jima, barring replenishing her ammunition, until she eventually sailed to Okinawa to support that invasion in March 1945. She would do much the same as she had been, pounding the shore and downing aircraft until April 1st. At that point, a kamikaze succeeded in punching through her anti-aircraft fire, crashing into her superstructure. It did minimal damage, though, and the battleship continued right on with her bombardment duties. She would remain doing such, aside from a brief detour on April 7th and April 8th, 1945. Here she joined other American surface forces in patrolling and preparation for engaging the Japanese super battleship Yamato should she manage to punch through the air attacks dedicated to sinking her. Considering those attacks did sink the massive battleship, West Virginia missed her chance to pound another Japanese battleship. She would remain in shore bombardment duty for the rest of the war, aside from minor repairs and replenishing her ammunition stocks. In fact, she would be off the coast of Okinawa when Japan announced the surrender. Sailing to Japan at this point, West Virginia was present at the formal surrender on September 2nd, which was a nice send-off to her active career, considering how it had begun 4 years before. Following the obligatory Operation Magic Carpet runs, West Virginia decommissioned on January 9th, 1947, and was placed in reserve. She would remain there, on the off chance her guns were called to action, until March 1959. She would then be taken from the Navy Register and ultimately sold for scrap on August 24th, 1959. USS West Virginia may have had a short, active career, but one cannot deny how much she did in that career, just as one cannot deny the triumph of engineering that was her salvage and rebuild. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.